Okay, so Steve's going to give us a talk now. We've had a good discussion in our groups, finding out what we actually know already, which is quite a lot, really, which is quite enlightening. And now Steve is going to give us a talk on various topics, on the Constitution, on sovereignty, on the Crown, basically. Yeah. On the Constitution, on sovereignty and the Crown. So, Steve, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Carol. I'm going to go over, let me have a look, see what is my first thing. Okay, so just to see where we were starting from. So this was my first. Okay, I'm going to go just talk a little bit about method. Then I'm going to talk about what are constitutions and about the relationship between constitutions and class. And then I'm going to discuss this idea of the sovereignty of the Crown in Parliament and what that term means. And then I'm going to ask who or what is the Crown. That's the thing we were discussing in my group. And then to think about this idea of the Crown as a social relationship. So I'm hoping we can weave the points that comrades have made in those discussions. I hope they will all come into this now. That's my hope, that we can sort of weave that together into there. And then I've just got this bit at the end. The Crown PLC and Royal Family Limited. So I'm going to come around with the idea we got two companies there that we need to look into, and what's the relationship between them. So so let me begin then with this first thing. So we're talking about and I'm not going, I've changed my mind from when I talked last week a little bit. I was going to talk about a couple of things, and now I'm not going to do that. But first of all, it is the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. That's the official title of the state. And it's worth noting that Great Britain is a geographical territory. It's not a nation. It's just literally the island on which we are now sitting here. Similarly, Northern Ireland isn't a nation either, because it's just part of Ireland. So it's not Great Britain and Northern Ireland is territorial. It's not talking about the existence of nations. Okay, so we've got two fundamental things: the united bit, which is the Union, and the Kingdom. And I'm not going to talk about the Union, although I did before. That's such a big topic that it needs a separate topic, I actually think. So I'm hoping, my idea was after today we could talk about that. So we're not doing everything here. We're going to do the kingdomy bit. There's the Church of England, which I'm not really discussing much, but that's part of the story as well. Might throw that in. Then there's this concept of the sovereignty of the Crown in Parliament, which is very important because it's mysterious, for one thing, and we have to sort of think what it means. And then I come back to, we're doing this in the context of looking at Tony Benn's answer, because Tony Benn puts an alternative to all of these things. To the monarchy, he puts the idea of the Democratic Republic. To the Union, he puts the idea of federalism. So that's about the territorial aspect of this story. And then against the Church of England, he's got secularism. So looking at this, Ben has got a kind of opposite to all of these things up here. And his bill is dealing with that. So it's setting itself up against the Union, the Kingdom, the Church of England, the sovereignty of the Crown in Parliament, and putting his answer there. And I mean, some comrades know this, some comrades might have come, but if we've been talking about it in the group for a bit, but if you just come into this new, we've been talking a lot about Tony Benn's 1991 bill that he put to Parliament, and that was one of the things that we were talking about. Now, I mentioned the idea of historical materialism, historical materialist method. What does that sound like? It sounds a bit, so I'm gonna illustrate it with this little diagram here. So if you can see that one, let's have a look a minute, move that over there somewhere. By the historical aspect, but what that means is we're going to look at our constitution as evolving over a historical period. How it's evolving, how it's changing, how it's going through certain transformations in history. And then by the materialism bit, it means that we need to look at not only things like the constitution, political parties, political struggle, but we're looking at the economic basis of things. Because in this period, we started out with feudalism over on the left-hand side, the monarchy 1066 to 1638. Then we've gone through this middle period of revolution, and then we've come out the other side where we beginning to become a commercial, agricultural, and then eventually industrial capitalist country. So we've gone through a lot of economic change over there. The classes, the social classes that existed at one point, they don't exist over here. So there's a complete different set of interests and so on going on. We could put it a little bit, my next one will just take on a little bit, to say that in the first part, 1066, that's like 600 years, which I'm only going to take 2 words on, but basically, we were 3 kingdoms: England, Ireland, and Scotland. England was the dominant kingdom, but the kings of Ireland and Scotland tended to bend the knee to the King of England, or Queen of England, as may be. This period in the middle, the period from 1638 to 1707, 70-year period of a revolution that takes place that transforms the monarchy, I'm going to argue, which was the king. So at this stage, the monarchy and king is the same thing. King equals monarch. But when we get over here into this bit on the right, we're getting the emergence of something different, which I'm going to argue is the crown, which is not the same as the king or queen. But this is quite mystifying. So we've got to try to look at it fairly carefully. I said 1638 because that's when the Bishops' War started in Scotland. Then the Civil War came afterwards. Then in 1649 we had the Commonwealth. Then Charles came back, Restoration, Charles II. Then in 1688 we had the Glorious Revolution, right the way through to this 1707 Act of Union. I suppose you could go to 1801 or 1800 to the Act of Union with Ireland, but that's not it sort of adds on later on. So I don't want to forget about that, but it's not really part of this transformation that's taking place. And over here, we've ended up with the United Kingdom. We've begun Britain. Britain's only begun on the right-hand side. Britain is invented here in the 18th century through a world war with France, through the creation of the British Empire, the colonies in India, the colonies in America, and of course, African slavery, that was one of the central parts of this. So you see why working out our constitution, where it comes from, we end up talking about African slavery and all those other things. There's a lot of constitutional things going on, and they're cultural things as well, and historical things that are being talked about right in the present period. So we've still got a king and queen, and we had one at the beginning, and we've still got a king and queen now. But what's happened has been a transformation of those institutions over this period of time, and that's the sort of thing that I wanted to emphasize. What's going to come? So I'm just looking over here in a minute. I did want to say something just about what is a constitution. So that's my kind of next point. How would we? Well, there's a sort of liberal way of describing it as well as a more socialist way of describing it. But I would start with the liberal point. If we're describing a constitution, what is it? Well, it's basically a set of institutions and a set of basic laws that regulate and define political relations between state and people. I suppose that'd be my simple version of what a constitution is. The Germans today call their constitution the basic law. So I think that's a good term for it, the basic law of their society. You could call it the supreme law, or the law of laws, because it's the law that enables you to make laws, you know, so it's like a special law almost, the constitution. It's a law that regulates the making of laws as well in the same thing. I noticed when I was looking around, the Constitution of South Africa, just as I was searching around different things, the Constitution of South Africa, they had 3 parliaments in 1983, and Celia will correct me if I got this all wrong, but in the 1983 Constitution, they had 3 parliaments. They had a House of Assembly, which was for whites, 178 MPs, a House of Representatives with 85 MPs for coloureds, as they call them, and a House of Delegates had 45 MPs for Indians. And Simon Bolivar had the idea in Latin America of a tri-cameral system, 3 parliaments. He had the idea of a chamber of tribunes, a senate and censors. And I was wondering to myself whether we've got a tri-cameral system or a bicameral system. It's normally said that we've got 2 parliaments. We've got the House of Lords and the House of Commons. But you could think we've got 3, because you might imagine that possibly the Privy Council is the one we don't necessarily think about. So you could say that the Privy Council ought to be factored into this. It's basically the Queen's Parliament, where she has the people who are brought in as Privy Councillors to advise her. So we know about the Lords and the Commons, but we've got this other body. It's quite mysterious. They have oaths. Nobody really knows what the oaths are. Jeremy Corbyn had to join the Privy Council. So we could argue about whether we got 3 parliaments or 2. Parliament of the people, Parliament of the Lords and the aristocracy, the Lords, and a Parliament for the Queen almost as advisory chambers. Okay. Now, let's have a look. I think one useful distinction to make is between constitutions that are ancient and modern. And I would say ancient ones are being written by people who are long dead. So modern constitutions are written by people who are still alive today. So I guess South Africa's got a modern constitution, but the British Constitution is ancient. So it was written by people 300 years ago. So our basic constitution was formed in the period from 1688 to 1707, I would argue. With a whole series of acts, the Bill of Rights and other acts that formed the constitution then. However, what we think about constitutions is that these constitutions are not just formulae, they embody social classes, they embody certain relationships between people and parts of society are almost kind of written into the constitution. So obviously our constitution of 1688 doesn't mention trade unions, and it doesn't mention the working class anywhere in that constitution, not surprisingly, because they didn't really exist at that time. So certain rights and relations get written into constitutions. I came across something when I was just looking at some of the things written in the middle of the 19th century. Marx is writing about the Crimean War. Okay, so he says that he writes this article, and he says that 40,000 British soldiers have died on the shores of the Black Sea. That's where the Crimean War, victims of the British Constitution. And he then says that the London Times spoke more truly than it knew when it said, with respect to this universal failure, that it was the British Constitution that was itself on trial. And Marx adds, it has been tried and found guilty. So we might wonder, how could it be that these soldiers were killed by the Constitution? Seems a bit of a strange sort of thing to claim. Well, so Marx goes on to explain. He says that the British Constitution, he says, is more or less a superannuated compromise by which the governing power is abandoned to some sections of the middle class or the capitalist class, on condition that the whole of the government, the executive in all its details, even the executive department of legislative power, or the actual lawmaking in the 2 houses of parliament, is secured by the landed aristocracy. So what he says is, when you look at the constitution, look how government is really taking place. Behind the formalities of the constitution, you have the landed aristocracy. And he says this aristocracy rules supreme in the cabinet, in parliaments, in the administration, in the army and the navy. And this very important part of the British Constitution, these forces have failed very badly in Crimea. In other words, the way the system of government has operated has completely let down the army and the armed forces and has led to this wholesale slaughter of 40,000 people in this war. The reason I say that is that is to get over the idea, which we sometimes have, is that constitutions aren't anything to do with everyday life. It seems like it's something abstract, a legal document, all about parliament and those sorts of things. But in fact, it's about government, and government is how laws are passed and how things are done. You know, we would look how our constitution worked over Brexit, for example. We could look in the ways in which our government worked over the deaths over COVID and things like that. So we have to get away from the idea that constitution is just something abstract and just about laws and just about institutions. We have the life and death of the constitution, of government, of the executive, the army, the navy, and all these other things that Marx is talking about. So Marx builds in analysis of class and how those classes work through the constitution and how power is worked through the constitution. I had another little example. I just thought of the Weimar Republic. In 1933, of course, the cabinet, the executive, passed an enabling act in 1933, which gave the new chancellor, a certain Adolf Hitler, powers to act without parliamentary scrutiny. So this is a constitutional change. The Weimar Republic turned into the Third Reich in 1933. But of course, it's not something purely about legal things. At the same time, what's going on is socialists, communists, trade unionists are being locked up and arrested. So in a sense, the constitutional change represented a change in the fate and forces of class struggle. So in the constitution, we have historically certain class forces with power. And then in the course of the class struggle, that's being changed and new constitutions are being written and new laws are being made. Okay. So we have to study the constitution both historically and in terms of those social forces that are acting through it. If we were going to look at the British Constitution, I could have had that one, I suppose. It seems to me that three key bits of the British Constitution are Crown, Parliament and people. I'm not sure whether the arrows are really right in this diagram, but forget about the arrows, but we've got them. We've got the Crown, we've got Parliament, and we've got people. We've got some relationships. So if we wanted to slim our constitution down to three elements, I think we'd have to discuss the Crown, Parliament, and people. Okay, Crown, Parliament, and people. Then that leads me then to this. We're getting towards saying, well, what the heck is the Crown? Because that seems to be very, very important in this whole story. So, keep my eye on the time. Yeah, well, we could have had this one, I suppose. We could have had the Crown, Parliament, the Church, and the Queen, in which case the Queen and the Crown aren't the same thing. So the Queen exists separate from the Crown. That would be another way of looking at it. And this way, you've got the Queen as the head of the Church of England. The Queen turns up at Parliament for the Queen's speech from the throne. The Queen obviously has some relationship to this thing called the Crown in some way. So in a way, the Queen is now separate from the Crown and exists in some other way. So that's the thing we're going to explore, this relationship of Queen and Crown, which seems to me a very, very important thing to understand. And I'll come on to that in a minute. So the next point is this one, sovereignty of the Crown in Parliament. What does that mean? Well, sovereignty, first of all, means authority or power. Who's got the authority or power to make decisions, to make laws? So the idea of sovereignty is very, very important in a constitution. And you will hear in our constitution people talking about parliamentary sovereignty. So people will say that in our constitution, the Parliament is sovereign. Now that sounds very democratic, doesn't it? Because if we elect the Parliament and the Parliament is the supreme body over everything else, then that sounds pretty democratic. So if people are using the word parliamentary sovereignty, they are telling you or saying that we live in a very democratic country, we elect our Parliament and the Parliament decides the laws. But this in fact is a fiction. Parliamentary sovereignty, that is just an ideological way of expressing it. Parliament isn't sovereign. That's just a kind of wrong way of thinking about it. The correct way of thinking about it is a different idea. It's the idea that we have the sovereignty of the crown in Parliament. Now, what does that mean? It means that sovereignty is shared between the crown and Parliament. It's like a sharing of power between crown and Parliament. The question is, who has the most power then? Is it the crown or is it Parliament? And in a way, if you think the crown is the Queen, you'll think, well, Parliament's got the power, the Queen hasn't got any power at all. On the other hand, if the crown is something different from the Queen, then it could be the crown is the powerful part of the Constitution and the Parliament is the weak part. And I would argue that the crown is a very powerful part of our Constitution and Parliament is the very weak part of the Constitution. So what does this mean? Well, every day you might know that you may or may not know that every day the mace, which is a golden weapon, it's a club, 5-foot long club from feudal times, is brought into the chamber by the Sergeant of Arms at the head of the Speaker's procession. And then it's put in its place on the bench there in front of the Speaker. The Lords, it turns out, have 2 maces, and they're not brought in, and here's the clue, they're not brought in when the Queen is present. And that's because the maces symbolize the Queen. So when the mace is in the House of Commons, the Queen is symbolically in Parliament. And once the mace is taken away, the Parliament can't do anything at all. So it can't convene itself, it can't carry on. So the mace has to be there to symbolize the idea of the Queen being present in the form of the mace that's symbolically brought in. So legally, sovereignty is shared between the Crown and Parliament. And of course, as Republicans, we're talking about the sovereignty of the people as the alternative to that. So, let's move on then. So let's move on to the next point, which is this then. So in that case, having talked about the sovereignty of Crown in Parliament, and it's the same way, by the way, that nothing is passed into law unless till the Queen signs the bill. So she has to the Parliament can't pass its own laws, even strictly speaking, the Queen has to sign anything into law. So the question then becomes, well, who or what is the Crown? That was the point we were discussing in our group. Is it an object? Is it a thing? Is it a golden jeweled hat? So we had that in our group. Is it a person, a king or queen? Is it a social relationship? Is it an individual, or is it a corporate body? So that's the thing that we need to think about. In a way, it could be all of those things, by the way. It doesn't have to be one or the other. It could be all of them. But we have to understand what the key ones of all that are. Now, you know, is it a bird? Is it a plane? You know, that was Superman, I think. In 1791, Tom Paine posed the same question. He said, what is this metaphor called crown? Or rather, what is monarchy? Is it a thing, he said, or is it a name, or is it a fraud? Is it a contrivance of human wisdom or human craft to obtain money from a nation under spurious pretenses? And he said, is it necessary? So in 1791, Tom Paine was speculating as to what the crown was. It's one of the mysteries of the Constitution. I had a quote from a couple of academic lawyers, Professor Sunkin and Sebastian Payne. He says, while the crown may be at the heart of the Constitution, the nature of the crown and its power remains shrouded in uncertainty and continues to generate controversy. Professor Sir William Wade said, even the most basic question, what is the crown, attracts some extraordinary answers. So this is one of the kind of mysteries of confusions of the Constitution. And if you were to ask somebody out in the street walking around, what was the crown? They'd probably say it was a queen. But they would be wrong to think of it in that way, I would argue. And if you take the ownership, just to illustrate the point, take the ownership of royal palaces, the Queen owns Sandringham House and Balmoral Castle. But Windsor Castle, Buckingham Palace and Holyrood Palace belong to the Crown, not the monarch. So just in the question of these palaces, there's clearly a distinction between the Crown and the Queen, and what the Queen owns and what the Crown owns. So the Crown is not the reigning monarch, nor the government of the day, nor a politicians, nor even civil service, nor even the nation. So it's one of the kind of strange mysteries. If you think the Crown is the Queen, then you'll think the Queen doesn't have any power, so really the Crown has no power. If you think it's some other force, then it may be that the Crown is the most powerful body in the country. In Teddy's government, Lord Rothschild came in as an advisor to Teddy's back in 1970. And he said he arrived at the center of political power. Until this week, he said, I'd never heard that the country, I'd never realized the country was run by two men I'd never heard of. And the two men he'd never heard of were Sir Burke Trend, the cabinet secretary, and Sir William Armstrong, the head of the Home Civil Service. So when you started to see, well, who's really running the country? They're running the country in the name of the Crown. There are a lot of people we never elected and don't even know who they are necessarily. So the Crown is not simply the Queen, it is something else. And it's understanding that to see the nature of the problem that we have. Okay. I'm going to argue that the Crown is really a corporate body rather than individual. And if we go back to the historical story, in the Middle Ages, the king and the Crown were the same thing, rather like a sole trader. If you run your own company, the company is you. If you die, your company's ended. There's no distinction between you and the business you're running. And the monarchy in feudal times was that. Later on, of course, you can think of a body being a corporate body. In other words, something more than an individual, something of a life of its own, becoming like a corporation. And that's how I'll describe the Crown. The Crown is like a corporation or a company, an institution with a board of directors. And those we have to know who those board of directors, how do they get to be the directors? But they are the powerful people. In 1649, Gerard Winstanley, in the middle of the revolution, said that England had just become a republic, and he said, well, he said, either the Commonwealth will continue and we will live in peace and freedom, or kingly power will be restored. So he was predicting that possibly the monarchy would be restored. And he said there's two choices here. One is for one person to rule, an autocrat. We'll have the king back as it was, like Charles was, as an autocrat, one person, one man to rule. Or he said, we'll have a few people to rule in the name of the king, an oligarchy. What we'll get back is an oligarchy. And in fact, history shows that what we got was not one king back. We did have Charles II and James II, Charles II and James II, but we ended up with a kind of collective crown, a few people, an oligarchy starting to rule the country in the name of the crown, which is what Winstanley kind of predicted. So we go from the individual monarch of the feudal times to this more like corporate body at the beginning of the 18th century. Now, I wanted to add another point, and this was the one I think that sort of was part of the discussion, which was this. We could think of the crown as a relationship rather than as an individual thing. Okay, and the question that I asked is, what rights do we have as subjects? And so that was one of the groups was addressing that. I think that was the one that Russell gave feedback on. And republicanism, we could talk, when we're talking about republicanism, we could talk about the crown and how we turn from a crown to a republic, but we could also talk about republicanism by talking about rights. So the discussion that group was having about what rights did we have, what rights didn't we have, is really a kind of discussion about, in a way, about republicanism, but looked at not from the top, but looked at from the bottom. So if we think of the crown as being a relationship between people, and this was the key thing that for Marx's idea. So in economics, we're taught that capital is machinery and means of production. And if that was true, then we always need means of production. We'll always need means of production. We'll always need machinery. But Marx said, no, that's wrong. Capital is not machinery. It's the ownership of machinery. And therefore, if it's the ownership of machinery, it's about the relationship between those who own the machines and those who work for those who own the machines. It's like the employer-employee relationship. In other words, capital is a relationship between people, between groups of people. And so the crown shouldn't be thought of as a thing, like something on your head, or even as an individual. It should be thought of a power relationship between the state power, if you like, and the subjects. And we can look at that as well. What is that relationship? Are we subjects or are we citizens? And I'm looking into that. I think we're kind of citizen subjects, because the law has changed in this country. So you could almost say we were citizens, but you could almost say we've still kept the idea of being subjects. So we're in a kind of funny sort of position. And so we could discuss the crown, not in terms of the crown, but in terms of subjects and citizens and the rights that subjects and citizens actually have. Okay. Which, interestingly enough, we got into a discussion, I think, in this group where comrades were talking about individual versus collective rights. Well, in a way, republicanism is actually essentially about collective rights, how we gain our freedom through democracy and we gain collective rights, as opposed to the individual notion of freedom being you do your own thing. So we as Republicans are interested in the rights of citizens and the power of citizens to be able to determine collectively what collective rights we should have, and not the rights of individuals. Okay, so Tony Benn has a very interesting part in his book where he talks about this relationship, and he says what you really need to understand about and he calls it the secret constitution. He says the secret constitution is made up of oaths. So we as subjects are in implicit relationship of loyalty to the crown. But he then says anybody who works for the state has to swear an oath of a loyalty to the Queen. All MPs have to swear oath of a loyalty to the Queen. If you become a privy councillor, a minister, or part of the opposition, Jeremy Corbyn did this, then you actually don't swear an oath of allegiance to the crown. They give you an oath and you have it imposed upon you. But then the bishops and the queens sort of all swear oaths. So Tony Benn's argument says the real secret constitution is based upon the oaths of loyalty that are given to the crown and the Queen that hides behind the constitution. That makes you think, well, we're living in a feudal state then, where it's all based on oaths. But I don't think that really gets it there either. So come back to my last thing. Well, what is the crown then? Let's come back to that point. What is the crown? Well, I think that the crown is a kind of the political form that capital takes. The political form that capital takes in this country. It is the power of the capitalist state. It's a corporate body. It's independent of any individual person. At the core of it is Her Majesty's Treasury. The most powerful body within the crown is the Treasury, Her Majesty's Treasury. It's the crown's magic monetary, it's capital's magic monetary, because they can tax the surplus and spend it on finance, on roads, on health and education, on wars or anything else. So in a way, this is like the crown is really the concentration of the corporate power in a capitalist state, is what I'd kind of describe it as. And of course, like any other body, it has a board of directors. So we might ask ourselves, well, who's on the board of directors of the crown? Who's actually the people in charge of this whole thing? I would have it as the Queen's the chair. Boris Johnson's the chief executive officer, CEO. He's actually running it from day to day. There are other ministers of the crown. There are top civil servants. There are heads of the armed forces, heads of the security services. These are the executive power, the power of the crown, the people who are actually in control of the state. Most of them are not elected, and most of whom we don't necessarily know who they are or what they're doing. But we do have some impact on who's elected to Parliament. We do therefore have some way. We didn't even elect Boris Johnson, by the way, only the people who did in his constituency. So we didn't really elect him, and we can't really sack him. Obviously, he was elected by the Tory party. And so that brings me back, I think, and I'll finish on this point really, that I'll pass over this next one and move on to the last one. So go that one and do that one, go on to this one. So I've arrived at this sort of point where we have got, I think, two businesses running this country. Hold on a second. Yeah. The first one, the Crown PLC, the Crown Corporation, Chief Executive Officer Boris Johnson. It's a huge enterprise. It's very, very powerful. It can tax and spend. It employs 430,000 workers. So like any company, it's got 430,000 employees. That's a big company on anybody's books. It employs 123,000 police, 145,000 soldiers. If this is Winstanley's kingly power, it's now massive. Massive power is in the hands of the Crown PLC. It's an international, multinational corporation. It's got embassies all over the world. If you think of it as a company, it's bigger than any other company, more powerful than any other company in this country. It's powerful. All right. The chair of the board, by the way, is always going to be HRH Elizabeth Windsor. So she has a role like a chair in a company, don't necessarily do anything, possibly have to be there just to know what's going on. But the actual business is run by the chief operating officer, Boris Johnson. And then we've got this other business over here, which is Royal Family Limited, which Prince Philip used to call the firm. And it's got 1,000 people working for it. So it's got 1,000 employees. They are all sorts of things like the keeper of the privy purse, the treasurer to the Queen, the Lord Steward, the Lord Chamberlain, the master of the horse, the Queen's equerry, the central chancellery, the orders of you could go on like this forever, but there's 1,000 people working in this little business. So again, the Queen and the Royal, we know that the board of directors of this company's was Prince Philip, is the Queen, Prince Charles, Princess Anne, and all these other people. They're two separate businesses, but of course the Queen's connected to both of them, right? So we mustn't mix up the Queen and the Crown. If we do, then we're misunderstanding what is going on. Those people who say that the Queen has lost power, the Queen is powerless now. She doesn't do anything. I fail to really understand the power of the crown is in this big, massive, corporate, powerful body. Who's more powerful then? If we said, is the Queen more powerful than Parliament, you'd probably say, well, Parliament's got more power maybe than the Queen. You might think that. But if you think who's more powerful, the Crown or Parliament, there's no doubt about it. The Crown is very, very powerful and Parliament is very, very weak. So the sovereignty of the Crown in Parliament, and finish on this point, this sharing of power between Crown and Parliament, all of the power is with the Crown. The Crown is the dominant part. And the trick of it all is to make us think that the Crown is really the Queen, and the Queen's just a little old lady who can't do anything at all, and therefore we don't need to worry about that at all. And to miss the trick to see that the Crown is actually a very, very powerful body in our constitution, and getting more powerful, by the way, under Boris Johnson, taking more power into its hands, because the Crown is becoming more authoritarian and the Parliament is going to becoming weaker relative to that. Okay, so just to summarize then, the Constitution, behind the Constitution are various class relationships. In our Constitution, it's an unwritten Constitution. The sovereignty of our system is in the Crown in Parliament. The Crown is often mistaken for thinking it's the Queen, and therefore thinking that the Parliament is really the dominant part of everything, the powerful part of everything, when in fact, that's the trick. The trick is it's the other way around. The body that's become powerful over the last 102 years has been the Crown, which has grown and grown in size and power and influence through the British Empire, all those other things. So the problem we've got is the power of the Crown to dominate our society, and how we do something about that. And the bit we still got to look at is the Union. I'm going to stop there. I don't know how long I've been going on for, probably too long. But anyway, sorry about that.
Wow, that's so interesting, Steve. I had no idea how powerful the Crown is. You think about it, the police, the army, they all swear allegiance to the Crown. They all work for the Crown. It's frightening, shocking, unbelievable. So thank you ever so much. Thank you. That was a really, really great talk. Loved it. Paul's got his hand up, so if you'd like to just stop screen sharing.
I'll stop screen. Sorry about that. Yeah. Stop sharing. Yeah,
I'll get faces.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Paul's got his hand up. Over to you, Paul. Unmute.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Steve. I first became interested in the Crown, as we now know it, when I started looking into what people meant by Crown properties. I first came across the idea when I was a parish councillor, and then I started to look into it, and this is where it can get pretty complicated, because you realise that Crown property, land and property, by the way, the idea in theory is, spotlight, I wonder what that was. Yeah, the idea in theory, at least, is that the monarch owns that land or property, but the individual monarch on the throne at the time does not have the power to sell or profit from it. I suppose it was an idea to stop people kicking off, because, obviously me and Carol have had a bit of an exchange in the chat, and the more we talk, the more people realise the power of the Crown. It's people do use the Queen and the Crown interchangeably, as if they're the same thing. I think if people really understood what was going on, I think many people would start to kick off, and that's what we need to get across, really. And I also agree with Steve that the whole business of the crown is to crypt. It's designed to look as if it's just any normal company, particularly where the crown landed properties are concerned, because in theory, it's not for profit, and any profit that is made is supposed to go to the treasury. So that's how they basically get away with it. But and on to another point, when 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 it comes to whether we're citizens or subjects, we're probably both legally, as Steve said, but it really hit it home for me when Larry said at a previous meeting, I think it was an internal working group meeting, when he said about the relationship with the police, and somebody apparently revealed, I can't remember if I got it right, but somebody said that you're there to protect the public, and somebody revealed, no, our responsibility is to protect the property of the crown, not the people. I hope I've understood that right, Larry. Perhaps you can recite it if I got it wrong, but yeah, I find that very interesting.
Yeah, no, yeah. I think you're absolutely right, Paul. I think they are. They're there. They're not there to protect us, that's for sure. They're there to protect the property of the crown. Absolutely right. Okay, Mari was the next one to have her hand up. Mari, over to you.
Do we have plenty of time, Steve, or are we?
Yes,
are we
we know we're not. No, sorry.
Good.
Yeah, no, we're not limited. So I just
Good. This is very useful to learn all these things. It is very basic. I noticed that in the Labour Party there is an absence, almost complete, of understanding of this subject, and also a sort of commitment or a tacit acceptance that one should not be interested in that subject, as if somehow it is vaguely, vaguely subversive to be interested in this, as if somehow it was the role of the Labour Party to make sure that we fulfill a pledge of loyalty between the party which has been created by the trade unions and the party of the employers, which have to connive forever. Somebody used the phrase, one of us used the phrase forever and ever. And I think this is where the church plays its part in all this. It is extremely profound and deep-rooted into the history and into the practice. And so I find this absolutely enlightening, because it gives me tools to debate, to write towards the Labour left, and to later on with the question of federation and the question of Ireland, and whether is it a territorial question, the question of the kingdom, or is it in fact linked with all this discussion about power. Just to finish, I have discovered that for the G7, Charles, Camilla, William and Kate and the Queen, they all invited the G7 to take tea at Windsor Castle at the end of the summit. And then Charles addressed the summit. And what he said was that the question of climate change, you know, he agrees with that. He's very a progressive man, and he's going to tackle it. And he's inviting the G7 to support the sustainable market initiative that he is creating together with businesses and private investors who will involve themselves in government efforts. And of course, Boris Johnson was there. There was not just him, there was also other people from, big people from you know, from the G7, including the EU representatives. And then about the pandemic, he has discovered that nobody is safe until everybody is safe. So he said, he used the word we, which I take it is a sustainable markets initiative, will work with businesses, the ingenuity of business, the political will, our political will, so that was we and our, and the public mobilization. So he was involving us in his initiative. And then it will be a partnership between government, business, the private sector, finance, for the sake of biodiversity and the protection of the planet from climate change. And then he finished by saying, we are going to unlock the private sector with its resources and its finances. 300 companies, global companies, according to the report, were present during that meeting. So it was a high-level political meeting, which was presented as just a social occasion. There is much more to be said about this, but I will write about it so that it can be shared.
Wow. Wow, Mari, that's incredible. Thank you so much. So all of this is going on above our heads.
Yeah.
And we actually have very little say in all of this. It's absolutely appalling. No say at all. That's appalling. Larry, you had your hand up next. Could you unmute Larry and speak to us?
Yeah, certainly can. Just coming back. Thank you very much, Chair. Just coming back on Paul's statement. Fundamentally it's correct. It was to do with the situation in Bristol and the proletariat taking the statue down and throwing it in the river. But they also besieged the police station after that, and the police commander came onto the BBC television and basically said that the police commander said, "We're here to serve the crown, not the people." That was his statement, and he said that, and he lifted the facade on the role of the police in relation to that incident and in general serving of the crown. What I would like to say is that the Constitution, and I've raised reservations about constitutions, and that is that it's basically they're written by the leadership for the workers to follow, and that's where I have the difficulty, is that people in higher positions than the people they represent write the rules, and we have to follow. So that's a difficulty. And bringing that back to ordinary everyday life, it seems to be ingrained in working people, no matter what class they come from. When I say class, I mean, I don't mean hierarchy, but people in ordinary circumstances, whether they be in a tenants association or anything else. It seems to be ingrained within them. When trouble hits the group or the organization, they always look to the leadership to resolve their issues, and they tend to look upwards. Middle class look upwards to resolve the issues, like employing a lawyer or something like that to resolve their problem, and not looking down to the proletariat to resolve the issue for themselves. And this was part of the discussion that the Labour Left Alliance had on the rise of fascism, is that the middle class looked up to the leadership to destroy and crush the working class movement that is challenging from below. And I think this is what we're talking about in relation to discussions over time, is the role of the Crown PLC. And I think it's most enlightening and educational that we keep banging drum on this as to what the crown actually means in relation to the government of our country. Thanks very much, Carol.
Thanks very much, Larry. Gosh, wonderful contributions here. George, your hand was up next. Over to you, George.
Right. One of the questions about the structure of the crown, which is what we're primarily talking about, is the judiciary and the city, both of which on the outside appear to have mysterious powers. But covering all this is the ceremony that goes on with the British legal year, the annual reappointment of judges, the ceremony at the Old Bailey, the High Sheriff, and so on. And also the City of London is covered with pomp and ceremony. I call it the entertainments part of the crown. I call it the entertainments part of the crown and the Queen. But the real power in the City of London is the Court of Common Council, and vested in the Lord Mayor, who looks after the interests of banking, mainly banking and finance entities. They are part of the main Crown PLC, or whatever you like to call it. That's and also the discussion proves to me that at some stage the Republican movement needs a publication. It needs a paper. Now, whether this is online or in print, I don't know, but we desperately need a publication of some sort to put the ideas to the wider, well, I mean, the last remarks of Larry Hyatt made it absolutely clear that we desperately need some kind of paper. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Another great contribution, thanks. And Diana, you the next one up with your next hand up. Over to you.
Oh, hi. Yes, Marie, talking about Charles' meeting. Well, first of all, say thanks to Steve about all the information about the crown. I'm finding it quite mind-blowing and a lot to take in. But I was thinking about where power lies, and I think real power seems to lie with corporations actually controlling our government. And then Marie was talking about Charles's meeting with all these business leaders, and actually so then I could see that it actually does all tie in together, because he's saying that the markets can solve all our environmental crises on the planet, and all these business leaders presumably related to the people controlling the corporations. And it's utter, his ideas are actually dangerously insane, because it's capitalism, and the corporate capitalism in particular, and the markets and profits, which are and driven and entrenched the environmental meltdown, and will continue to do so unless we can stop them. I'm not sure we can stop them. I think we're all doomed, but we have to try.
Wow, thank you so much as well, Diana. That's a bit mind-blowing, a bit depressing, isn't it? Because you're absolutely right. Capitalism is the one that's destroying the environment and our planet, and to think that private companies can save it is naive beyond belief, isn't it? Good heavens. Thanks. Well, thank you very much indeed. Paul, I see Paul's got his hand up again. Paul, over to you.
I would like to come back on Diana's point. I agree with what she said, and also I think there's obviously a lot of people on the left have talked about Extinction Rebellion in terms of the environment and so on. But I remember an Oxford Extinction Rebellion Facebook group. And I noticed on there, although I didn't do myself any favours, I didn't express my view very tactfully, but I'm afraid looking at, you know, there were a lot of views on there that that I regarded as, quite frankly, middle-class snobbery. What I've noticed for a lot of them, they might be very well-meaning, but in fact, they narrow the environmental problem down to individual consumer choices that we make as individual consumers. And I was rather annoyed as a socialist that many in the Extinction Rebellion movement, they don't really have an answer. They don't really understand the nature of capitalism with and the role that capitalism plays within the environment. So Diana is absolutely right. And I wish I'd see some acknowledgement from the environmental movement. I know I'm going off the subject a bit, but yes, I think there's either people are just not aware of the role of the corporate world, or they're just naive, because it's not simply down to the choices of the individual. And I think there's a lack of understanding of what life is like for people potentially on a very low budget. But that's another point. But yes, when Diana made her point about the environment and the role of the corporate world, that's where I want to come in. So sorry if I've gone off the subject.
Yeah, thanks very much, Paul. Absolutely. They're actually, I mean, we're encouraged as individuals to do our bit, but actually what we can do is minuscule to what the corporations do and could do if they were to go in a different direction. So yeah, absolutely right, absolutely. I can't see any other hands up, so I'm going to go back to Steve to come back and sort of round that off with a right of reply, if you like, but to round off what's been said this evening. So over to you, Steve. Steve, if you just unmute yourself.
Again, sorry, start again. I want to start with Larry's point. It was just a little example, but a powerful one of how the police are actually the arm of the crown. They're not in any sense other than that. You know, the police commander said he's there as to represent the crown, and that's exactly what he is, and the judiciary too. So the police, the judiciary, the armed forces, they're all part of the crown. They're all different parts of the crown. The one point I wanted to get over to people, and I think it's a really important point, if we think that the crown is the queen, then we're going to be sold the argument that since the queen, well, she's quite an old lady now anyway, she doesn't seem to be a very powerful person at her age. She seems to therefore be a person without much power. Okay, Boris Johnson gives her a speech, and then she reads a speech out from the in the House of Commons, almost as if she's just there to do as she's told, and can't do anything other than that. I seem to be getting feedback. Somebody mute, please. I think somebody muting. Okay, is that so? That's to really misunderstand the situation. The crown is something different from the Queen. And once we understand that, and this is why I come back to Diana's point, because I think it's, I'm not going to go on to say what George said, but if we see the crown, see, we start thinking the power in this country is in the hands of corporations. It's McDonald's, it's HSBC, it's Nissan, it's Shell. You know, those are the kind of things that we already recognize. But what we're not recognizing is the biggest corporate power in the country is the Crown PLC. That's more powerful. It's like it's looking at us in the face and we can't see it. We're looking everywhere else to sort of deal with the problem. And the one that's looking at us and saying, here we are, we can't see it because we think it's the Queen. We've seen the Queen going by waving at us. Oh, there goes the Crown. So we're not seeing what's massive in front of us because we misunderstood it. And that's part of ideology. That's part of the way in which they conceal from, they're concealing from us what's actually going on. So we can't see the danger that the Crown poses its power in the hands of Boris Johnson, for example. We see Boris Johnson's dangerous, but he's got massive power because he is the chief executive officer of this massive corporation with 500,000 people working for it. And the treasurer that can print money, as much money as you like any day of the week, and bribe as many people as they want to do. And they do it all in secrecy. And they're spying on us and we're not allowed to spy on them. So that's what we're dealing with. And most socialists, I think the problem is we've got McDonald's, we've got HSBC, we've got Nissan, we've got Shell. Yes, we have got those problems. But the thing that's protecting a lot of them, the thing that is the superpower in the land, is the one that socialists aren't dealing with because they think it's the Queen. And then they've been sold the idea, well, the Queen doesn't really do anything. She's just a feudal monarch from, I don't know, the 15th century or something. And I think if we can get socialists to understand the nature of the power we're dealing with, then we can persuade them that we must do something about it, as opposed to ignoring it. Because what does the Queen do? No, it's not really worth bothering with. It's just not powerful at all. So I think to get over the idea, the biggest corporation, the biggest source of capital and power in this country, it's not a feudal institution at all. It's a big, giant corporation, massive corporation. Now that leads me back to, I think George took a tack that I could have taken, should have taken, and would take, which of course is to show, and it's kind of in the model, but I didn't use it in my talk, to show the connection between the transition from land and feudalism, when the king and the crown was the same thing in the Middle Ages, to this corporate body, this capitalist corporate body, took place in the glorious revolution of 1688 to 1707. And at that time, what happened was the City of London invited William of Orange to come over and become the king. The city invited him to come over to be the king, to protect their interests, their financial and commercial interests. And from that point on, the crown became the financial power in the land. So the crown was really the City of London in a way, by another name. And it's interesting that the big thing they set up in 1694 was the Bank of England. That was one of the things this revolution set up. And who was on the board of the Bank of England, the first board? William of Orange, King Billy, and his wife. They were both shareholders of this new bank that was set up. Okay. And it's not that well known. I don't know how long it goes back, but there is an office behind the Speaker's chair in the House of Commons called the Remembrancer. What is the Remembrancer? People don't know this. Well, the Remembrancer is where a representative of the City of London sits every day and looks at any bill going through the House of Commons to check that it doesn't adversely affect their interests. So they're there checking it all out. Can you imagine if the TUC had an office behind the Speaker's chair to make sure that none of the bills going through Parliament would adversely affect trade unions? You'd think, yeah, what's going on here? You look at the Remembrancer and that's what you'll find. So George is absolutely right. And then you've got all those things that he spoke about in the power of the city. And it's interesting that when the Queen goes to the City of London to do her visit, and she's met by the mayor of the City of London, the Queen, when she gets to the gate, bows her head. Now, we have to bow our heads to the Queen kind of thing, but the Queen bows her head when she goes through the entrance into the City of London to be met by the Lord Mayor of London. And there is a committee, and when the Queen dies, it's also automatically Charles will become king, more or less. But there is a committee that formally agrees it. Okay, it's a rubber stamping job, so they never reject it because it's, you know, automatic. You know, the king dies, the queen, or the queen dies, the king comes. But there is a committee, so formally somebody could say no, by the way. And sitting on that committee, you'll find there is somebody from the City of London. So in a certain sense, the monarchy was kind of taken over in 1688 to 1701 to 1707. That is a break in the whole. So we have the feudal monarchy where land is the number one thing, and then we move on to where the City of the London has taken over. So I could say the crown was corporate power, but you could say it was the City of London in another guise. And the key linkage between the Bank of England and the Treasury is absolutely at the center of our politics, of our economics, and everything that's going on in this country, and what we can afford, what we can't afford, who gets paid, who doesn't get furloughed, any of these things you're going to care to name. It's the Treasury. Now, I've got a comrade who has been studying the Treasury, and I'm going to ask him to come along, because I think to complete this story about the crown, we got to talk about the Treasury and what it does and where the magic money tree is. And I think that's also part of the story. So just to finish on that point, I just want to get over to comrades this one point. Sovereignty in this country rests with the crown in Parliament, but the crown is the powerful part of this relationship, and Parliament is the really weak part. The crown controls Parliament through the whip system, through the executive. All the ways that the Tories get their legislation through is because the crown runs and controls Parliament. Parliament is not an independent body, it's not a separate power. It is under the thumb of the crown by and large, you know. Proroguing Parliament, you know, that was another example. The judges stepped in there, but I mean, it revealed to us something about the nature of the Constitution and what the crown could do, what Boris Johnson could do. He wasn't stopped by Parliament, he was stopped ultimately by the judges. And they were arguing about where sovereignty was. Was it with Parliament? Was it with where was sovereignty with? Johnson was arguing proroguing Parliament, that's the Queen's job, sort of thing, i.e. the Crown's job, that he could do it basically himself. So I'm going to stop there, comrades. I hope we can elaborate on this theme, but it's very important for Republicans to realize the job we've got is a big job and it's a powerful job. And you can't tackle capitalism in this country and ignore the crown. And that's what the Republican case is about. Just getting rid of the Queen won't solve the problem of the crown, because even if the Queen went, we'd still have this huge body of powerful body that would still carry on if we didn't do something about it. My last thing is this: a republic would abolish Royal Family Limited, because there'd be no jobs for those 1,000 people being equerries and all those other things that I mentioned. Okay, so we get the trade unions in to negotiate a redundancy package for them, obviously. But for the crown itself, the 430,000 people working for the crown, what does the republic do about them? And my argument would simply be, again, they should be in trade unions, of course, but we would have to transform the crown, this big corporate body, into a democratic organization. So we would be saying to those people working for the crown, you should be part of our democratic republic. Make sure that we have state institutions that serve the people and do not serve the crown. So I think we would democratize the crown and abolish the Royal Family Limited and just shut it down and redeploy them. Okay, there we go.
Wow, that's amazing, Steve. Phil has got his hand up, and we have got just a couple of minutes,
go
Phil.
for it.
So I'm just going to give the spotlight to Phil. You're muted, Phil. Yeah.
It's Paul. It's Paul, not Phil. No.
Oh, sorry. Do apologise.
Right. Yeah, you could argue that going back to what we call the sovereignty of parliament, you could argue that because part of our parliament is elected, the House of Commons, of course, that in some way becomes a justification for what the current system is, because the idea in the general public's mind is that we elect our parliament, and the rest of what really goes on is kind of hidden, although thanks to the internet, many of this information is obviously publicly available. Steve wouldn't be able to do the presentation if he didn't have all this information. So the information is there, but yes, I think I mean, some of you will have heard of Labour for a Republic. They actually gave a talk to my CLP at one time, and it was a bit of a letdown in a way, because they talked about the role of the monarchy in the House of Lords, but none of this stuff about the Crown. And I think that in the past, Republicans have failed to really articulate where power lies, really, because they've fallen into the same trap or they appear to have fallen into the same trap as, all we just got to do is get rid of the monarchy. Well, all you'll do then is just put the Crown powers in the hands of the Prime Minister at the time, or what will become the new president. And what Steve has demonstrated and others have demonstrated is that there's a lot more to it than that. And also, talking to trade unions, my understanding, well, I could be wrong, but I could imagine that if you're an employee of the Crown, you can't, technically speaking, you probably can't join a union unless you join the United Community, because obviously that's for self-employed and people that aren't currently in paid work. But yes, at the moment, because they work for the Crown, you probably can't join one, although they probably got organisations that they could technically join that class themselves as a union, but I don't think it's quite the same thing. But yes, yes, so Republicans in general, certainly those that are Republican within the Labour Party, do need to do a lot more in relation, talk a lot more in relation to the Crown, and realise that the monarchy isn't even the problem as such. It's really the Crown. And yes, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Yeah, that's some really important points there, Paul. Yeah, the problem is the Crown and not the Queen. Yeah, absolutely. And people were talking in the chat as well about the role of the unions as well, as you pointed out. Really, really important. I helped to run the trade union group of the LLA, and I'd really like to bring this up. I'd really like to bring this up for a meeting, for one of our meetings, and put this on the agenda, because I think it's so important. So I'll be doing my best to put this on the agenda of our next TU group meeting. Thanks very much, Paul.
Can I make one just final small point, Carol, just to finish off with?
Absolutely.
Just one final point. I just thought, as I mentioned, Hitler and the Weimar Republic, just to kind of illustrate the point that when Germany became the Weimar Republic in 1918, they removed the Kaiser and they called themselves a republic. And it was done by the equivalent of the Labour Party. But the Weimar Republic kept all the powers in their constitution. They transferred those powers from the king, the Kaiser, to the president, Hindenburg. And in 1933, it was the key point, Hitler could not have become the chancellor if it wasn't for the fact that the president with the powers, the kingly powers, as it were, in the Weimar Republic, to invite Hitler to become the prime minister, as it were, or the chancellor, as it was in Germany in 1933. So the German Weimar Republic was a monarchical system with a president. And so our objective is not, as Republicans, is not to do that, but to create a thoroughly democracy from below, Republican democracy type system that we've talked about previously. You know, that's how we see it. Getting rid of the Queen, replacing the Queen with a president is not nothing. Don't get me wrong. It's not that we'd say, oh, we don't want that, but that is really to fail to understand what needs to be done to make a democratic and ultimately socialist, a social republic, ultimately is our aim. So just to find out, that's what happens if, you know, don't get mixed up, think you got a president, it's okay. Otherwise you'll hand power to Hitler or somebody like that. Okay, finish on that point.
Thanks very much indeed. That last point, Steve, I'm just wondering if when Portugal got rid of its monarchy, if that's what happened. I don't know the politics of Portugal, but shortly after they got rid of their monarchy, they ended up with the dictator Salazar. So I'm very interested to know if that was the sequence of events there as well.
Well, it'd be interesting. Perhaps you should check that out as while you're over
there.
Yes,
yeah, I'm going to. Yeah, we've got a few people who are knowledgeable on that, so I'm going to find out, because that's really sparked my.
And just to add, they've got a great Republican story. I mean, I know it's not a full democracy, Portugal, but they had a massive struggle, didn't they, in 1974, 75 to overthrow their dictatorship and become at least more democratic anyway in a republic. So there's a whole very interesting story around about 1974, 75 in Portugal.
Absolutely, it was called the Carnation Revolution because they put flowers. It was done without bloodshed, and they put flowers. The soldiers put flowers in their guns, gun barrels. So it was a very interesting. I'm going to go and find out if it was the same story. Anyway, that was absolutely fantastic. I really enjoyed that. I've learned so much from your talk, Steve, and from chatting in the breakout rooms at the beginning as well. So that was absolutely fantastic. So just to say thank you very much. And not only Steve's talk, which was brilliant, all the contributions were absolutely brilliant as well, you know, raising so many important points. So I just want to thank everybody, Steve, for putting all this together and giving us such an amazing speech, and to everybody who's attended and all their contributions, which have been absolutely outstanding. So thank you very much, folks. And I'm going to close the meeting now. Goodbye and thanks.